Welcome to Planet People Mining, voices at the crossroads of mining, communities, and sustainability. I'm your host, Allison Koppel. I have over 20 years in this space in 5 mining companies. I then found myself in transition when this podcast emerged through reconnecting with my incredible network, whose insights may be heard as one-off episodes on other platforms, while here they take center stage. If you're also a trailblazer with stories from the field, a mining colleague curious about what these people even do, if you are interested in this field of impactful, motivating work, or from another industry, join us as we celebrate their contributions, demystify their roles, and explore the community and sustainability issues they tackle. And for our Spanish-speaking audience, busca Planet People Mining en Español. Human rights. There are no low-risk jurisdictions with Claire Larner. Today I speak with Claire Larner. Her career began with humanitarian assistance programs at the UN in New York. She then transitioned to the mining industry, working with the International Council on Mining and Metals in London, and later Newmont, where she led the development and rollout of the human rights standard. After relocating to her native Bermuda, she joined Pillar 2 as Director and Head of North America, EU, and UK. We discuss how to translate complex human rights principles into practical applications, even in countries like the US and Australia that might not traditionally be associated with such human rights challenges. All right, I'm here today with Claire Larner. Claire, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Allison.
So I've obviously known you for a long time, but why don't you introduce yourself so everyone else can get to know you beyond what I shared in the bio? What are a few major life and work milestones?
Great. Thank you, Allison. And thanks again for inviting me to be featured alongside some of your other guests, all of who I have an enormous amount of respect for. So, really appreciate the invitation to join you. I've been in the sustainability space for about 17 years now. A lot of that time has been in the mining sector, and I focused on business and human rights issues for most of that time. I currently work for a specialist business and human rights advisory group called Pillar 2. We were founded by our CEO, Vanessa Zimmerman, who worked on the team that developed a key international framework around business and human rights, the UN Guiding Principles. And we support businesses and others to identify, assess, and develop effective responses to their human rights risks and to meaningfully engage stakeholders around their human rights approaches.
So, when did you realize that this is your calling? Because you have specialized more and more in a number of years in this intersection of human rights and business. And it is a very specific space and a very unique area of work. So, help me understand some of the earlier experiences you had that made you say, this is what's truly interesting to me.
Yeah, good question. And I think, like a lot of people who ended up in the mining industry, which is where I started out, and that's really where I discovered this intersection of business and human rights issues. But like a lot of people in the industry that I know, I guess with the exception of technical experts like geologists or like environmental specialists, but I know a number of people that sort of ended up in the mining industry by accident. And that was definitely the case with me. I was working for the UN in New York after I graduated, working in humanitarian aid, providing funding to UN agencies' rapid responses and underfunded emergencies. And it was absolutely fascinating work, but I never saw any of the developmental outcomes from the work. So then I moved back to London and I was working very temporarily for the ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals, thinking that I would never ever end up in the mining industry because its values clearly didn't align with my own value set. I thought I'd be much better suited to the nonprofit sector. But while I was at ICMM, I was exposed to the potential positive impact of the industry. And I do say potential because, as we all well know, the industry can have some very negative impacts as well. But it was through my work at ICMM and seeing this potential for positive outcomes over the longer term and through work with ICMM member companies, many of whom had made real commitments to improved environmental and social performance. So, through that work, I became really interested in the sector and ended up staying at ICMM for 8 years. And then after that, I did a short stint as a consultant. And then I joined Newmont, where we met and led their human rights work for 5 years before joining Pillar 2 last year.
I've known you for at least, I think we met 10 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And I never knew that you worked at the UN in New York. And so,
Yes.
what drove you to get there and be interested in humanitarian assistance?
I think my degree sort of sparked my interest in some of those global issues and challenges. I did a degree, a master's in politics, and then very quickly sort of joined the UN after graduating. And it was just very interested in all of those geopolitical issues, obviously, that the UN thinks about and addresses, and then humanitarian aid, particularly, was a fascinating field, very interesting, very fast moving. But as I said, sort of lacking in some of those developmental outcomes, or the agency that I was with, at least, we didn't track those developmental outcomes. So it wasn't always that satisfactory from that point of view. But yes, it was 10 years ago, Alison, that you and I met. I had to go back to LinkedIn to remind myself, but it was 2014. So exactly a decade ago, we were working together at Newmont when I was writing their human rights standard in Denver for a couple months and then pilot testing that by living in Ghana for a couple months. And you, I remember, were a great support as I was figuring out how we really embed human rights requirements and expectations across the business and what we do to support site level teams and how we really operationalize those requirements. So here we are a decade later.
And, I just remember though, from the beginning, I was always very impressed of how practical you approach the topic. I mean, you talk about human rights. I would venture to say most people listening do not have a broad formation from the UN exposed to this language and may think about human rights in these very broad, esoteric terms. But here you came in and you helped us understand, how this framework applies to the US, how it applies to Ghana, how it applies to Australia, and a lot of countries in between in a very practical way. And I saw that immediately about your work, and you were very always open to adjusting and refining and figuring out what does this actually mean for this context and how do we roll this out. But I saw that not always, I will say, not everyone understood as quickly.
Yes.
And
Yes.
maybe
And
I
still doesn't.
well, that's where I was going, is what is often misunderstood about the human rights and business space from your experience?
Yes, it's interesting because even though we've had the key seminal framework that I mentioned, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, even though we've had that framework since 2011, there's obviously been other external evolutions, like evolutions around regulatory requirements that build on the requirements of the UN Guiding Principles. And for the most part, a lot of mature and responsible companies have made huge strides in implementing and embedding the requirements of those frameworks and the regulatory requirements around business and human rights and other pieces. But I still think that this area, and perhaps sustainability and social responsibility, the social responsibility space in general, is still considered by some as a little bit fluffy or perhaps less technical or perhaps not generating business value in the way that some other roles or business functions might do. But you and I both know this value protection aspect of the work we do is really vital for businesses to be able to deliver on their financial commitments. And it's no less important that some of those roles you might typically see or might typically be seen as generating financial value. And then when I think about the sort of the technical side of things, when we're, for example, doing a human rights analysis, we might be reading a commentary from a given human rights convention. We might be looking at additional detail related to a core human right to determine if a breach has occurred. And if so, what does that mean for remediation? And that can be very technical work. So it might be less quantitative than some other analyses in the space, but it's absolutely no less technical. And I think the same can be said for the expertise and the skills that we know is needed in the social and the community relations space. The other misconception I think that I touched on earlier is that this notion that standards in this space are voluntary and that it's optional that companies adopt a lot of these frameworks or think about how they manage their human rights internally. But actually, we're seeing this real shift towards more regulatory requirements and much more harder edged expectations for companies now around some of these frameworks. You're seeing that through, as I said, the regulation. You're seeing it through industry standards like those being developed under the Consolidated Mining Standard Initiative, which is sort of increasingly creating stringent standards for the industry.
Couple things you just said. Where did this come from that the social areas or human rights space is non technical? It's very technical what we are doing. There's a strict discipline, it's informed, and the work is organized in a technical way. So I just thought that was interesting that you organically also brought up that notion.
Yeah, and I think you might see that because the field itself is newer. I mean, obviously, it's not new when you think about a framework coming out in 2011, but it's newer compared to sort of health and safety standards and frameworks and some environmental standards and frameworks. So I think we're still in that process of evolution in this space. And hopefully, in 10 years' time, we're no longer talking about this is a non-technical area or human rights being non-technical risks. Hopefully the addressing of them is just so embedded into corporate culture that it's no longer a discussion that's coming up on podcasts or elsewhere.
Exactly. I hope quicker than 10 years, though,
Yes,
before we
yeah, well,
get
that would
there.
be great too.
Help me understand, you were talking about in this framing of technical and non-technical and how others within the companies understand this work. Where I personally saw a lot of challenge, I was saying a little bit earlier, is, for example, working with teams in so-called developed countries, the US, Australia, and places that maybe just assume that if you're following the law includes human rights, and therefore, what is this that this person is talking about? Why do I have to listen to this human rights discussion? Are there any practical scenarios or examples that you have that you've used to help colleagues with this frame of mind to better understand your work?
Yes, I definitely think there are. Well, I definitely in my career encountered challenges in the, as you framed it, sort of developed country context where people do not think that human rights are necessarily relevant to their day job because they assume that the state has the relevant protections in place. But we know that there are no low risk jurisdictions from a human rights perspective. So, for example, you raised Australia as an example. We all know that there are vast issues with Aboriginal and Indigenous rights in Australia. We know that there are significant labor rights challenges in the US. There are a number of jurisdictions that we might consider to be developed that still face very significant human rights challenges. And I think the challenge is always translating what could be quite conceptual when we talk about human rights to very sort of practical examples. So, in Australia, if we are contaminating water, what does that mean for community rights? What does that mean for rights to access livelihoods? And sort of putting it in terms that the folks on the ground or at site level or in country, putting it in terms that resonate with them, I think is always the challenge, but necessary to get that understanding and that buy in for addressing impacts.
I think you just spelled it out right there. And that relates to an example that I've experienced and that you and I have talked about in the past, where I was working on a project site and the company had the water permit, could access water, but it turned out that this rancher, the animals always just access water also from this source. And so, because we now had the right, that we fenced off the source, and then the ranchers' animals were no longer able to access the water. Now, from a legal perspective, of course, we had the permit, we had the right, but all of a sudden, this rancher is no longer able to have the same level of livelihood that he had previously because of our action. And I found in that discussion, I was hitting a wall of just using a legal framework with my colleagues, but found it extremely helpful when we introduced the human rights lens to that discussion. And I said, let's just see it from this person's perspective. Their ability to do what they have done every day to feed their family, feed their animals, have a livelihood is impacted because of us. Now, that's the new reality. How are we going to manage?
Yeah, and I think you've touched on the key point of a human rights approach, which is that it's really about thinking about risks to people and not sort of risk to business. And so those typically legalistic approaches would just be thinking about business risks or protecting the business from a legal point of view. But when you're thinking about a human rights framework and particularly applying the UN guiding principles, you need to be thinking about that risk to people approach. And that's difficult for companies. Their enterprise risk management systems and other risk related processes have developed and evolved to address business risk. So, trying to sort of shift that mindset or thinking about how do you build in that mindset to your existing systems and processes is very challenging for some companies.
And so, I mean, I know now you work across sectors, do have, still a lot in the mining sector, but what are you seeing broadly are emerging issues that industry should be more focused on?
Yeah, I mean, we've just touched on a whole host of potential issues in the industry and beyond. I think what's interesting now is not just the number of issues that companies are expected to address, and those range from social risks, they range from nature related financial risk to just transition issues. But it's not just really the issues themselves, it's how companies are now expected to be addressing these issues that's changing. We see this in a lot of the regulation coming out of the EU in terms of those expectations that due diligence integrates human rights and environmental considerations. So there's that real sort of expectation that risks are addressed holistically rather than in silos, which I think has evolved in recent years. I think also we tend to focus on the, emerging issues or the latest issue or perhaps those issues that are top of mind for investors. But as we discussed many, many times at Newmont, there still is this sense of needing to get the basics right. So, thinking about how do you get stakeholder engagement right? What does meaningfully engaging stakeholders look like? How do you manage your risks? How do you measure your impacts? And those pieces, those sort of fundamentals, are just as important as what's the latest issue that companies are also expected to be addressing. We sort of see that around some of these cyclical discussions that come up as well. So, for example, when we think about free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous peoples, discussions have been taking place around FPIC in the mining industry for decades. And they're now ever more important, those conversations, particularly in the context of renewables projects, many of which we know will be taking place on Indigenous land in the future.
Before even touching on FPIC, which I do want to go back to, just what you said first, that was music to my ears because you and I have both said it so many times that it is about the basics and getting the basics right. And when you see a big problem or you want to implement this broad focus on human rights, it goes back to how did we define who is in the area of influence? Who is impacted by this work? Who do we consider stakeholders? What is our relationship with them? How do we talk to them? How do we listen to what they have to say? If they complain, do we respond to them in a clear, transparent way based on criteria? And it goes back to these basic systems to have into place. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up because that doesn't go away. And more now that I've been consulting and across broader number of companies, seeing how critical those first steps still very much are today of having those basics right.
Yeah, and not just stakeholder engagement for the sake of stakeholder engagement, but really what are you hearing that's making you change the way that you do things as a result of that feedback and that input? And we're seeing increasingly external stakeholders like investors and NGOs and others, they really want to see how companies are listening to what they hear and are then incorporating that feedback into the way that they do business. So it's not just these sort of vacuous consultations to tick a box are no longer acceptable to a lot of stakeholders.
Exactly. And being able to meaningfully and demonstrate that to show these are the conversations I've been having. This is what I've been hearing. And these are the actions that I have taken because I heard this feedback. Or I always say it's okay to go back and say, you know what? I didn't take on board your feedback, and here's why. But to not just, like you said, check a box and say, oh, I held the town hall. No one spoke up. I guess it's good. We can move on. So I'm just really happy you brought that up.
Yeah, and I do think the external landscape is driving, particularly around disclosures. They're requiring companies to provide a lot more information about that meaningful stakeholder engagement. And you see it through public benchmarks, you see it through some of the regulations that are coming out, but it's no longer just okay to disclose your policies and that's enough. There's much more detailed information that external stakeholders are requesting from companies now in this space.
Absolutely. And I do want to go back to what you were saying now, the second point you brought up around the concept of free, prior, and informed consent. And your very accurate statement that this has been discussed in the mining industry for decades. This is not a new concept. And how relevant it is for the renewable energy industry that is in rapid growth. I mean, just in the US alone, the second largest landholder after the federal government are Native Americans.
Yeah.
And that's just official land holdings, not to mention traditional areas or areas of significant cultural heritage.
Or those with treaty rights that might not be enshrined in national legislation and things like that. So it is vast, you're right.
Absolutely. And I also find, in a very general sense, that this concept of FPIC is only recently coming into the discourse in the US. And I don't know personally how much you've been part of this discourse in the US, but I find myself having very preliminary conversations of what even the letters F, P, I, and C mean. And what I do also bring up in this conversation is before we go down part of what I call the alphabet soup, and this is FPIC, and this is a term, and this is complicated, it goes back to basics. How are we understanding our neighbors? How are we knowing who to speak to? How are we listening to what they have to say and building a genuine relationship? And that is the basis for all of this work of understanding what their perspective is, and then eventually back to our discussion on human rights, if our activities could be impacting their human rights and their rights to be able to be informed about what impacts could be happening on their land and have a say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think there's been a lot of conversations get caught up in the semantics or the specificities of what exact terms mean. But what you've just described is really fundamental. It's that just inherent respect for your neighbors and inherent respect for human rights. And whether that leads to an agreement, whether it leads to you not proceeding with activities, but at its heart is really respect for human rights and how you do that through your work.
So, you have worked across a number of interesting organizations, and now as a consultant across even more organizations. I'm sure there are people who you look up to as mentors or sponsors who have helped guide the way for you. What are some of the traits you admire in these people who have helped guide you along this way?
I have been so lucky in my career to work for some really amazing people who definitely mentored me at critical stages of my career journey. I think one of the traits that I value enormously is that encouragement and acknowledgement, which, is much easier said than done in busy day jobs. You can sort of forget to encourage your colleagues and really sort of acknowledge their work. But I remember when I was starting out in the mining industry, sometimes reviewing documents that I had no idea what they meant or had very little value to add to sort of reviewing them. But even if I just corrected typos or added a few commas in here and there, when my boss at the time kicked them up the chain for further review, he was always very, very explicit about acknowledging my contribution, however small it was. And that sort of stuck with me as a real leadership trait that I think is very important. I think I've been lucky enough to work with genuine collaborators, so colleagues that really value collaboration, that actively seek feedback regardless of hierarchies or internal positions, etc. So I've really admired that approach to collaboration as well. And then I think another piece is around this art. And it's definitely an art of being able to challenge things that you don't agree with. And I've seen some great leaders willing to do this with their own leaders and really have appreciated seeing how constructive pushback can really be a force for good when trying to drive change. And I think if you couple that sort of constructive challenge with diplomacy, which is another key trait that I admire, it really can open doors and advance conversations. So, diplomacy is another key trait for me, but we all know diplomacy is not always enough. Sometimes you've got to get the elbows out and make sure you're getting the right people in the right rooms for the right conversations.
The mining industry, just generally speaking, has always embraced either,
No,
especially
agreed.
within companies.
And sort of being humble, I guess, comes with that as well. And that's something you're right. The mining industry has not always done well.
I will call out something very specific that I appreciate that you have taught me, because I also believe in recognizing other people's work and appreciate when people recognize my work. If there's anyone out there who has received a consulting proposal from me in, the last few months, will notice a very detailed work plan that is very well organized in a format. It is the Claire Larner work plan template. It is. I tweaked
You
it.
know I love a good plan, Alison.
You created this master Excel spreadsheet, and I have used versions of that since 2014. I've tweaked it ever so slightly, but not really because it is that good. So I will just
Amazing. Actually, I shouldn't take full credit for that. I think that sort of evolved out of my time at ICMM. So I've definitely adapted it and I think, significantly changed it for our Newmont days, but I wasn't the originator of it. So just to give acknowledgement, as we're talking about acknowledgement, where it's due, that's where that came from.
yeah. But anyway, I think of you with every proposal. So
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad I'm front of mind.
you definitely are. And just to pause on this for a second, that is one of the very tactical components that you have taught me about the consulting space and being able to apply the expertise across a number of clients, which is very different from working in house in a company. And you have had this unique career. I mean, the UN, which I still appreciate learning that today, the UN from a humanitarian assistance, the premier industry association for the mining industry, deeply embedded within a mining company, both at a site level and the corporate level, and now working across clients as a consultant. What would you say is the biggest learnings around having this multi perspective view around this issue of business and human rights?
Yeah, I mean, because it's sort of on the theme of human rights, and just I think it's the way that the world works, regardless of the industry that you're in, the company that you're in. It's really all about people at the end of the day and how you work with people internally, how you internally collaborate in this space and in social responsibility and community relations in general. These aren't sort of siloed issues. So how do you build those internal mechanisms where you can collaborate and learn from others that have different skills and expertise than you do? I think that piece is really important. And then externally, how do you learn from leaders and experts and local community members, and how do you sort of use their expertise and experience and insights and perspectives to shape your work? I think those pieces are very important. And so policy, systems, processes, all of that piece, obviously that's the nuts and bolts and the day-to-day running of companies, but the heart of all of those systems and processes, there's people. And if they don't think what you're doing and what they're doing is important, you're not going to be progressing practice or making improvements. So that sort of applies now, I think, still in the consulting space. I mean, our work is very varied. We might be working on a human rights saliency assessment for a pharmaceutical one day. We might be then advising an extractives company on human rights considerations for their growth strategy the next. But at the heart of all of those things, there is a consideration of people and how they work to improve things.
How fascinating. You get to go from pharmaceutical to extractives. Not everyone gets that
It's very
array.
interesting. Never a dull moment. Hectic, but never dull.
No, that's interesting. And where are you now based?
I'm based in Bermuda. I moved back here about 2.5 years ago to be closer to family. So left Colorado and moved back here. I'm lucky to be from a beautiful island, but haven't lived here till several years ago. So it's great to be back.
Oh, what a unique perspective that must also bring into the professional experiences you have.
Yes, absolutely.
And so this is such a unique field, but there are more and more people interested in understanding that this is a professional discipline. This is a professional field, this intersection of business and human rights. So, what advice do you have for others in this field to succeed?
I think just, and maybe sort of thinking more broadly than just the business and human rights field, but maybe sort of the sustainability space, the social risk and impact space, community relations space. The first piece of advice that I would give, and it's probably most relevant for people in their early stages of their careers, and it's advice that I wish I actually took myself or was given as I was starting out, but this notion of spending time living and working in a country that isn't your home country. I just think those perspectives and experiences are so, so valuable for anything you might do in the future. So, even though I've been lucky enough to travel my whole career beyond several months at a time in a country, I haven't spent a significant amount of time living and working abroad, and I wish I had done. So, for those that can, would definitely encourage you to do that. I think related to this, my love of plans that we touched on. And I actually listened to Beatrice's podcast with you, which I loved and really appreciated some of her advice around being intentional. And I think that's important as well, particularly if you're in a busy job and sort of caught up in the day to day. It can be challenging to be a bit intentional about, right, where do I want to be in 5 years' time and what do I need to do to get there? So I think that piece is important. And so having a plan for that. Though, having said that, and much like the detailed birthing plan I had for my daughter, things do not always go as you planned. So I think sort of remaining nimble is also important. It may be sort of external factors that end up dictating what your next move is and where you end up. And it was a family driver, for example, for me to move back to Bermuda. That wasn't on my career plan maybe 10 years ago. So I think, you have to be flexible and you have to be nimble as well. And then I think finally, those traits that I admired most in the leaders I work with now and have worked with in the past around being a diplomat, but also knowing when to be assertive and tenacious is important. And the most successful people I know really have the ability to draw on both of those characteristics when they need to.
And you are particularly, I will say, particularly good at walking that line between being diplomatic and being able to align very strong opposing personalities
Yes.
to align to a common solution. So it is not easy. And I do recognize what you said. And it goes back to our human rights discussion about the importance still of having a plan and having a vision and having an intentional way of wanting to do something, but also recognizing that the external context may force you to adapt differently.
Hmm.
But in companies who say, well, human rights, that's just covered by the law, or that's just the natural being of people living, it's not something explicit that I have to have a plan on. Then the external environment changes or something happens, and they really don't have a framework to help manage through that situation. And so I like how you aligned your work with your approach to how you live your life, where you move, how you describe your family. So I really liked hearing that.
Yes, a plan with flexibility is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, listen, Claire, I just loved this conversation. And even though after 10 years, got to know you a little better through this conversation. So thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alison. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for joining us. If you like what you heard, please like, provide a 5-star review, and amplify.